This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is what happens when a government discovers a new way to survive. Not by winning trust, by controlling visibility, by deciding who gets to speak, who gets to organize, and who simply disappears. And then something changes. Not in the streets first, in the wiring, in the signal. Because once the outside world can still see inside a locked country, the next thing that changes is not public opinion. It's the price of violence. If you want to understand what's forming right now, stay with me. Because this isn't just a crackdown. It's a test of a new intervention machine, one where a protest can trigger a threat. A blackout can be defeated, and a regime can be hit without an invasion. And in a moment, I'll show you what actually controls the next move. What actually controls the system now is not ideology, not borders, not even armies. It's thresholds, invisible lines that decide when something stops being internal and starts becoming everyone else's problem. For decades, power worked like this. A state could suppress its own people as long as it kept the violence contained, quiet, unseen. That rule is breaking because when visibility survives repression, control stops being local. It becomes conditional. Every baton swing, every bullet, every order given in the dark now carries an external price tag. And the people enforcing the crackdown know it. This is why warnings matter more than strikes. Why language is chosen carefully. Why involvement is promised, but not defined. The system is being rewritten so that violence itself becomes a trigger, not for sympathy, for retaliation. And once that logic is accepted, the regime isn't just fighting protesters anymore. It's negotiating with a clock it doesn't control. Because the next question isn't whether force will be used, it's how much force can be used before the system answers back. And that's where this starts accelerating. For years, this kind of shift happened slowly enough to feel normal before repression looked like control. Now it looks like risk. Before, a shutdown meant silence. Now it means delay. Before, violence ended movements. Now it prices them. That change didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived through repetition. Each blackout, each warning, each time the outside world hesitated but kept watching. And that normalization is the most dangerous part, because systems don't collapse when rules are broken once. They collapse when broken rules become routine. What used to be extraordinary is now procedural. Visibility survives. Threats escalate. Nothing resolves. And the people inside the system adapt to that new math. They learn how far they can go. They learn how long they can wait. They learn what kind of violence still counts as internal. But the margin is shrinking because once violence becomes a measurable input, someone eventually decides to collect. And the moment that happens, the story stops being about dissent and starts being about consequences. Which brings us to the first shock. The first shock didn't arrive as a turning point. It arrived as a number that was supposed to stay manageable, contained, explainable. Dozens dead. Some of them young, others wearing uniforms meant to enforce order. That matters because when casualties start appearing on both sides, the system stops reading like a crackdown and starts reading like instability. This wasn't chaos. It was force applied deliberately. And it was answered violently, which is exactly the scenario deterrence language is designed for. Not to stop protests, to change the cost of suppressing them. And here's the part that doesn't get said out loud. Once deaths are counted, they stop being tragedy and start being data. Data that gets watched. Compared, weighed against thresholds no one publicly defines. Stay with me. Because the real danger isn't the number itself. It's what happens when that number keeps moving and no one can agree when it becomes unacceptable. That's where the system starts to crack. This is where the hidden mechanism takes over. Because the system doesn't respond to outrage, it responds to leverage. What keeps the structure standing isn't loyalty. It's cash flow. It's the ability to pay the people who enforce order before they start asking questions. That's why street pressure alone is never enough. Noise can be absorbed. Crowds can be dispersed. Even fear can be managed. But payroll cannot. When a state operates without buffers, without reserves, without room to breathe, every disruption hits immediately, not symbolically. Mechanically, if revenue slows, enforcement weakens. If enforcement weakens, restraint disappears. And when restraint disappears, the costs spike fast. This is the trap. Violence is used to maintain control, but violence accelerates the conditions that make control unaffordable. So the system keeps pushing harder, spending more, tightening faster, until it's no longer suppressing unrest. It's funding its own collapse. And once that cycle begins, no speech can stop it. Only interruption can, which is why the next shock doesn't look like protest at all. The second shock moves faster, shorter, sharper, less forgiving. Work stops, signals go dark, orders don't land. Not everywhere, just enough to slow movement, enough to delay response, enough to make people in charge start calling each other instead of giving commands. This is where systems panic. Not when crowds gather, when routines break, because routines are what keep force predictable. And unpredictability is expensive. Every delay forces a decision. Every decision creates exposure. Every exposure widens the gap between control and collapse. And here's the part that accelerates everything. Once disruption proves it can spread without leaders, without speeches, without coordination, it stops being containable. You don't shut this down with slogans. You don't intimidate it with threats. You either outspend it or you outlast it. And when neither option is available, the clock stops being your ally. That's when people on the inside start recalculating quietly, individually, because survival systems don't fail all at once. They hollow out, and you can't see that happening from the outside until it's too late. This is where it stops being abstract, because the system doesn't experience pressure. You do. You feel it when prices jump without warning, when work disappears overnight, when information slows just enough to make every decision feel risky. You feel it when silence becomes strategic, when speaking costs more than staying quiet, when waiting feels safer than acting and more dangerous than both. This is what living inside a pressure system feels like. Not constant terror, constant calculation. And that's the point. The system doesn't need everyone afraid. It only needs everyone unsure. Unsure whether today is normal. Unsure whether tomorrow crosses a line. Unsure whether help arrives or makes things worse. If this matters to you, don't look away. Because attention is no longer passive. It's leverage. And what happens next depends on who keeps watching and who decides the cost is finally too high. Because once that decision spreads, it doesn't stay personal. It becomes systemic, and that carries us forward. This is where the ripple escapes its borders. Because once pressure systems become visible, they stop being local experiments and start becoming templates. Markets react before governments do. Allies reassess before statements are written. Every actor watching asks the same quiet question. If this breaks here, what else breaks next? That uncertainty spreads faster than protest ever could. It moves through supply chains, through energy routes, through currencies already under stress. Not because anyone chose sides, because instability doesn't ask permission. And the more visible the pressure becomes, the harder it is for outside powers to pretend this is contained. Observation turns into positioning. Positioning turns into alignment. No one commits yet. No one intervenes openly. But the board starts filling with pieces, And once enough pieces are placed, movement becomes unavoidable, even if no one admits they caused it. This is how global systems tip, not with announcements, with accumulation, and the uncertainty only grows from here. From here, the system doesn't choose a single future. It opens three. The first looks like adjustment. Pressure holds. Violence moderates. The system bends just enough to survive without changing what created the pressure in the first place. Control remains, but it's thinner, more conditional, more fragile. The second is erosion. Nothing dramatic. No decisive moment. Just attrition. Cash drains. Compliance weakens. Enforcement slows. The system still stands, but every day costs more than the last. Authority becomes performative. Power becomes reactive. And then there's rupture, the option no one schedules, but everyone prepares for. A threshold misread, a response miscalculated, a moment where deterrence stops delaying and starts triggering. Not invasion, not occupation, just force applied hard enough to collapse confidence. No one knows which path wins. Because each depends on timing, on restraint, on how many people decide to wait, versus how many decide they're done waiting. And that's the danger. Once multiple futures are live at the same time, control stops being a strategy. It becomes a gamble. And the final move hasn't been made yet. There's no clean ending here. No moment where the system resets itself and everyone exhales. Because this isn't a story about victory. It's a story about exposure. Once a government learns it can be punished for what it does inside its own borders, every other government notices. Once visibility defeats silence, every blackout becomes a liability. Once pressure systems prove they can stack economic, informational, strategic, they don't disappear. They get reused. And the most dangerous part is this. Nothing we've talked about requires a decision to escalate. It only requires one decision not to stop, not to look away, not to slow down, not to pretend this is contained. If you want to understand what comes next, you can't watch this like a headline. You have to track how thresholds move, how warnings harden, how pressure becomes policy, because the next time this model activates, it may not look like this. It may not happen there, and it may not give anyone time to adjust. If you want to stay ahead of that, stay with me. This story isn't ending. It's replicating